So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am, my skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got, no matter what the situation is, and you just kind of adapt and overcome.
What are you going to do with all this? You can't even take care of your own files and get them put into the current system, but yet you want to go collect other people's things. So what are you going to do with this? Who are you giving all this to?
Oh, happy Friday. I am excited to be here, and I want to just give a shout out to all of my really loyal and wonderful show supporters who support the show. I couldn't do this without you. And I also want to thank everybody who's in chat every week. It is amazing how many messages that I get from people I didn't even know were listening. And we're talking about people that you would never have a clue. They're not in ufology, but some really, really cool people that are paying attention to what I'm trying to do with UFO Classified. I'm trying to very genuinely get information out as best as I know it. I do a lot of research, and I definitely have had my blinders pulled off in a rather cruel way over the years. It's been a process. And so if you go back and listen to my first shows over half a decade ago, and you listen to some of the guests I brought on and my own thought process, you'll see how that is just really drastically changed. And now I want to get to the bottom of things. And I definitely think, like I mentioned, Skinwalker Ranch has been kind of a centerpiece for me because I live in Utah, because I have done so much over the years on that. And what I really want to put forward tonight is, at the end of the day, can I verify with 100% accuracy that what's taking place at Skinwalker Ranch is non-lethal weapons testing? I can't, but I'm thinking that the evidence is mounting to sway it away from UFOs. And that's just what I'm going to put forward there. So I can't, I'm not things in this subject are not finite. And when it comes to testing things and manipulating populations and all of this stuff, it's not easy. And especially it isn't easy for one person out there going against a huge control system. But I will do my best, and I appreciate your support. Tonight is going to be a very, very interesting show. I'm really excited about this because I think this is going to give us some fresh perspective on things. Stephen Snider has done a lot of work underground, behind the scenes, and has made connections that are very important for all of us to see, because a lot of times we think that, okay, we're going to look at UFOs, and so we turn to ufology, and unfortunately, when you skim the top of that pond, you're getting disinformation, you're getting delusional information, you're not seeing the deeper layers that have penetrated NICAP and APRO, that are working and speaking, people that are speaking at DEF CON, or people that are involved in QAnon. You're not making the connections, which my guest has been doing, and I think this is really going to be a pivotal show tonight. So listen to this and make sure you spread the word about this. Stephen Snider, a.k.a. Recluse, has been in the conspiracy racket for over 10 years now. He's a longtime curator of the Visup blog, a site dedicated to parapolitics and high weirdness. In 2020, he branched out into publishing, releasing his first book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, in April. Most recently, he released his second work, A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment, the first in a trilogy chronicling the rise of both Epstein's network and the New Right in the U.S. and the U.K. He is also the host of The Farm, the Cult podcast, and a frequent contributor to Pennyroyal podcast. He is going to be moving into filmmaking and much more, and I had the pleasure of being interviewed by him on Wednesday for The Farm, and that was really cool. But Stephen, I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for finding me. I'm glad that we have made this connection, because in the few conversations that we've had, we're starting to put some things together, and it's going to be really interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And definitely very excited to be here on your show, too. And it was great having you on mine. But yeah, I mean, it's always great, to find collaborators people to collaborate with who kind of seem like they're on a similar path.
Absolutely. And I just, for me, I wanted to say, I've been about UFOs and yada, yada, yada. And I have not had, it's just been recently that I have kind of taken a step forward, because I'm seeing so many connections in ufology with the intelligence community, with people that have a political or religious agenda that has been there for a long, long time, and they've been pulling the strings behind the scenes. And you have gotten that and done some pretty in-depth work, and we'll get into that. But I want to ask, just first of all, to say, how did you get into any of this?
Well, I mean, it's been a pretty complicated road, I guess, getting into all this. Of course, my dad, he was into a lot of conspiratorial type stuff, had been for most of his life. Of course, he had served in the Army, as had many men of his generation. Not 100% sure, but I believe he was in some branch of military intelligence, probably signals intelligence. He'd been stationed at a listening post in Greenland at one point, and had also served out his career at Fort Meade. So, but Dad never really liked to talk about anything with his service, but he had certainly gravitated towards a lot of strange explanations of things, or at least what would have seemed strange to me as a kid, growing up in the 90s. But, I have kind of these distinct memories of, listening to William Milton Cooper with him actually on, road trips across Colorado. And
wow.
Yeah. So, Dad definitely had always kind of put me into some, interesting head spaces. I mean, he was just, in a lot of ways, really a larger in life character, and something of a local legend, I guess. I've actually never told this before, but I guess to kind of further increase the mystery around me, the family's longtime attorney, who Dad had a good relationship with for many number of years, also had political involvements locally in West Virginia, and actually knew, I think it was Jay Rockefeller, whichever one of the Rockefeller cronies was the senator of West Virginia. I think he might actually still be their state senator here, or he might have retired. I don't know. I try not to pay too much attention to politics.
Well, it's probably safer that these days, I'm thinking.
Yeah. But, so yeah, Dad definitely had, encountered some interesting people over the course of his life, certainly. And then, strangely for me, my kind of interest in UFOs went back to the first time I took psychedelic mushrooms, actually, which again sort of went around.
That might do it.
Yeah. I was actually at the dorm at the University of Colorado Springs. And Colorado Springs is just a miserable place for psychedelics in general. If you've ever been there, it's like right at the heart of focus on the family. And at the time when I went there, it was like the kind of place where people would seriously like have prayers over their, Big Macs at like the local McDonald's before they started eating. It was very strange. And I've grown up in the South too. And even that was a little like, woo. Yeah. No, I took mushrooms and never even had hallucinations as intense at this, but I went to the cafeteria at the dorms because they did this kind of late night thing where you could get some food at about 11, and I walked into this thing and I had this distinct image of like these gray aliens walking around the student body in this kind of like fogged out environment and so forth. it was just insane. And that had, was what sort of spurred me to start looking into some of these more arcane metaphysical works, because I had kind of wondered, basically, is that a thing? Do people actually see gray aliens, when they take psychedelics? But it is actually. Surprisingly, that came up a lot in the clinical research, actually, Rick Strassman had done on DMT. I believe it was back in the 90s. Naturally, got a lot of funding from that, from the Scottish Rite branch of Freemasonry. But nonetheless, in the clinical trials, they had quite a few people who reported seeing gray aliens. And from some other research, I guess that is somewhat common. And I guess that kind of provides some interesting context to some of the theories, I suppose, we'll talk about over the course of the show about what might be behind at least part of the UFO phenomenon.
And yes, I have no doubt that this is going to be a very, very interesting show. And thank you for sharing some of that. And so after you had this experience and you thought, okay, this would be very cool to get into some of this. What were your next steps?
Well, see, ironically, from there, that was when I had started looking at some of the remote viewing stuff, because obviously also UFOs, aliens had come up a lot in that kind of literature. And then more ominously, though, another thing that I had noticed when I was looking at Strassman's DMT experiences was the fact that a fair amount of the participants had come down with some type of cancer, actually. If I'm not mistaken, I think maybe even Strassman's wife had contracted it or something like that during the experiments. But that was another thing that really showed up a lot in the remote viewing, among the remote viewers as well. In fact, I think Pat Price, who was one of the most celebrated of them, had succumbed to cancer, at least officially. I know there's a lot of theories that he had actually survived and had been living incognito for years afterwards. But that was another sort of reoccurrence. And, a lot of these connections were very interesting to me, and that had kind of gotten me to look more at, MK Ultra and Project Artichoke and all of that good stuff, or I suppose not so good stuff. And yeah, that had, spread out into a lot of other branches, because, those programs really touch almost everything imaginable, really. So lots of stuff you can learn from that. And yeah, over the years, it kind of sent me into this deep journey into parapolitics and all that good stuff. So, I became more of a kind of a formal historian, if you will. But the weird stuff has never been far from my heart, I suppose.
Well, clearly, I think that I can relate to that, and I think everybody listening can relate to that as well. And so and it is an interesting journey to see how each of us gets involved in this, and then kind of we spread out and find areas to research. And for me, I never, like I always say on every show, I never would have expected my research would have taken the kind of the dark turn that it has, but unfortunately this is something that is really important to look at. And so let's go back to the remote viewing program. Let's go back to let's go back a little bit before that, because I want to talk about some of your work that you did with regard to UFO organizations and the people involved in the CIA, and perhaps motivations for getting involved in UFOs.
Okay, sure. Well, obviously one of the big ones was NICAP, which had been so just heavily infiltrated by a lot of CIA and intelligence officers. And of course, it was one of the very first of the, major, I think it was pretty much the first of the major civilian organizations dedicated to this kind of thing. But it was also sort of interesting to me as well, because NICAP had also had a lot of overlap with this organization that I've written quite a bit about, called the American Security Council, which during the Cold War it was almost akin, I guess, to something like the Council of Foreign Relations, but for the military-industrial complex. In fact, one particular researcher from that era had even described it as the heart, if not the very soul, of the military-industrial complex. And the ASC had an ongoing relationship with NICAP really from the very beginning. I think it was General Aldrich who was a big ASC guy, had also been one of the early figures involved with NICAP. And later you would see a lot of overlap with people like Barry Goldwater and even the founder of the ASC, John Fisher, who had become a NICAP member kind of later in the organization's history. So you also had like a lot of these private actors, if you will, who became involved in these civilian groups. And I mean, from the kind of research that I've done over the years, this really isn't very surprising that you do see these kind of connections. I mean, this really tied into a lot of the political warfare objectives that the United States had, been toying with throughout the Cold War. And I mean, of course, you go back to the Robeson panel. The first major intelligence study of the UFO question. And of course, it had advocated a massive amount of propaganda, to deal with the phenomena. And one of the figures who I think was extremely significant who was involved in the Robeson panel was a man named Stephen Pisoni. And it should be emphasized, Stephen Pisoni was also the only psychological warfare expert involved in the entire panel. So a couple of years later, Pisoni ends up in a very enigmatic organization known as the Institute for American Strategy. Now, this outfit had been set up around 1958, and it effectively had been involved in efforts to indoctrinate military officers at the National War College. And a lot of these training seminars became very controversial. There was a lot of indications that came out later that they were actually trying to use like John Birch Society literature to indoctrinate military officers. And the John Birch Society was really very much like the alt-right, Alex Jones, that type of thing of its day. So this was pretty far out, especially for, the late 1950s with the specter of Nazism only, a couple of years in the rearview mirror, so to speak. But Pisoni ends up at this IAS outfit, this full-blown political warfare bureau, if you will, that was kind of set up by the American Security Council, by the National Security Council, which obviously oversees so much of our intelligence functions and what have you. And there were a lot of other interesting characters that ended up in this outfit. One of them was General Edward Lansdale, who was one of the preeminent counterinsurgency experts of the United States during that era. He would be involved in Vietnam. Earlier, he had engaged in the counterinsurgency operations in the Philippines. And an interesting thing about Lansdale is he was obsessed with using the mythologies of populations against them. In the Philippines, he did this quite a bit. And one of the most famous or infamous, if you will, tactics that he employed was to have some of his commandos go out, capture some insurgents, kill them, and then drain them of blood and hang them from trees. And the reason why this was done is because there were extensive vampire myths in the Philippines, and he wanted the insurgents, the communists, to think that these men had been murdered by vampires. Another thing that he did was to go around and have Masonic all-seeing eyes painted during the nighttime on the doors across from the houses in which insurgents were dwelling, so that theoretically the first thing that they saw when they woke up in the next morning and went outside their front doors were these Masonic all-seeing eyes staring back at them. And one of the famous tactics that he had come up with, or at least suggested, unfolded around the time of the Bay of Pigs. He wanted to have a submarine send off an elaborate fireworks display and beaming these transmissions into Cuba effectively to get them to believe that the second coming of Christ was imminent and that they needed to overthrow Castro to make way for Jesus. And later, during the congressional investigations in the 1970s, they humorously referred to Lansdale's approach as elimination by illumination. That was really funny, but unfortunately, in real life, it was not very funny. So you've got Pisoni, this preeminent Psy-War officer who had been involved in the Robeson panel. He's there with General Edward Lansdale. There's this big general who was obsessed with using mythology against local populations and what have you. Another guy there was Colonel Raymond Sleeper, who had overseen Blue Book for a time, had overseen Wright-Patterson's Foreign Intelligence, or was it Foreign Technologies Intelligence Division there, which is quite famous in the literature. You've got Henry Regnery, I believe, one of the members of the Regnery family, who was kind of the reigning one at the time. Of course, Regnery was a big publishing house. It was responsible for, lots and lots of right-wing literature. In fact, members of the Regnery family are still around. They actually have been supporting Richard Spencer, of all people. So that should kind of show you what they're about in this day and age. And that's pretty much what they've always been about. Man, God, and Yale was, of course, one of the famous publications of Regnery Press, but less well known, they also published some very influential texts in ufology. They included works by J. Allen Hynek, whose Raymond Sleeper had actually been there with Regnery and the IAS. And
go back there. Go back there and say that one more time.
They published Regnery Press, which was known as a right-wing publishing house that published works by J. Allen Hynek. Works by Jacques Vallée, including the famous passports to, was it Magonia?
Yep.
Magonia. So that was published by them. Same publishing house that published Man, God, and Yale by William Buckley. And just all kinds of essentially Cold War era propaganda and so forth. So the publishing magnet behind Jacques Vallée and Hynek is there in this Psychological Warfare Bureau with all of these other, Prussian right-wingists and so forth. Very interesting cast of characters. And, of course, this was kind of a coordinating body for the American Security Council, the CFR, if you will, of the far right in the United States. But there were a lot of other interesting guys in there. They had ties to an organization known as the Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture, which was extensively linked to a infamous European organization known as Les Surcow. That would effectively be the Bilderberg group of the international far right. Les Surcow is still with us. It is an absolutely evil and vile network that has been implicated in all kinds of outrages over the years, including numerous sex trafficking rings involving minors in multiple continents, in fact. It was implicated in the Dutroux affair in Belgium, and the Jimmy Savile stuff in the UK. It even has ties to Colonia Dignidad in South America. It has links to the Franklin scandal here in the United States, in addition to ample amounts of arms and drug trafficking and all kinds of other wonderful things.
And so I just wanted, I just have to stop you there, because isn't it kind of funny that the people that are yelling about all of these things and creating this, let's look over here, actually the people that could be behind some of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually been a tactic really that's been used. I mean, really, it goes back for years and years, but it really became an obsession with the far right, especially in France. Really in the aftermath of the Second World War. But the French devised a counterinsurgency doctrine known as la guerre révolutionnaire, or revolutionary warfare, that is phenomenally influential. It really is what all of American counterinsurgency doctrine is based off of. The Phoenix program was a direct outshoot of this, as was Operation Condor in South America and so forth. But yeah, effectively the French, they're fighting the French Indochina War. They decided to study communist tactics to see, what they could do to counter them. And their basic conclusion was that they had to embrace all of the tactics of the communists wholesale. And not only that, but they had to be willing to go to lengths that the communists weren't willing to go to. So it was like, if the communists were willing to go into a village and shoot all the, males in the village, we've got to go in there and kill everyone because we have to beat them at their own methods, essentially. So yeah, and it was this whole mindset effectively that prevailed. You were going to go in and just essentially abandon any kind of morality whatsoever, and then you were going to turn around and accuse your opponents of doing the same kind of insanity that you're doing, only at a much greater length. So yeah, I mean, this was essentially a former doctrine that was embraced by these groups, in the Cold War era. And I mean, I got one other thing I want to point out about the IAS. Okay, almost all the members of the early American chapter of the World Anti-Communist League were also major officials in the IAS. People like Lev Dobryansky, Daniel Rao, all of these wonderful people. The World Anti-Communist League is a fascinating organization. It was instrumental in setting up Operation Condor and all of these other quote-unquote freedom fighters that you see all throughout South America and so forth. Many of these groups were trained at organizations like the Political Warfare School in Taiwan, which was almost surely directly modeled after the tactics that the IAS developed. And if you want to see what these people are like, please do Google searches and look for the death squads in South America that prevailed all throughout the Cold War era, and especially during the Iran-Contra period in the 1970s during the Dirty Wars. And please take a good look at the dead bodies and the mass graves that these operations left in their wake, because that's what the World Anti-Communist League was about. That's what the Institute for American Strategy was about. That's what the American Security Council was about. That's what the CERCAL was about. That's what all of these people were about. And that is what it took to maintain the American empire, and what it still takes to maintain the American empire.
And I think it is, it's so critical to understand that, you've got the same people that are involved in some of these organizations and involved in some of these projects that were basically, inserting the extraterrestrial hypothesis into the narrative and using getting into NICAP, creating NICAP, and then keeping that going as a means to influence the public and then collect data and then you've got APRO and different things. And it's really interesting to me to see some of these iconic figures who are held up to these, they're almost mythical proportions. They're people that are supposedly looking at UFOs and trying to bring us the truth. And they're involved in the intelligence community, and they're involved in, they're psychological warfare specialists, or they're, all of this stuff. And yet we're looking at this, like I said, from kind of the top level, where it's like, oh, wait, these are people, somebody's telling us that they're looking for UFOs and they're cool. They've got a title behind their name, so we're going to believe them. They're actually pushing for disclosure, and but it's like when you look at the real life, when you look at their connections, when you look at all of these things, you see that the UFO topic has been very blatantly manipulated, and unfortunately now with this new quote unquote disclosure movement, it's still the same variation on the theme, promoting the same types of people that weren't truly interested in UFO disclosure or actually studying the phenomena. It was just it was a smokescreen.
Yeah. Absolutely. And a lot of that just goes back to the origins that so much of this stuff, many of these players had, in these psychological warfare efforts, going back to the early Cold War. Again, to go back to the French for a second, the French had a really interesting take on psychological warfare, and especially some of the guys who got into some nasty things in the private sector, people like Agenter Press. So when these guys are going around and doing their war operations, they refer to them as intoxication operations. And frequently, they talk about their ability to intoxicate. And the reason why is because, in a certain sense, to the French, intoxication meant poisoning of the mind. So that was effectively what all of this, was about, really. It was to utterly poison the group mind, effectively, of the public as a whole, to send them into essentially a kind of grips of insanity, if you will. And this is just something, again, that was an absolute obsession within the intelligence community. People really just don't understand the extent and the amount of money that was put into these psychological operations. It really was phenomenal. And I know, especially in regards to UFOs, that's something that a lot of people struggle with. Would the U.S. government, would members of the intelligence community, would private actors really invest these kind of resources into creating a mythos? And I would answer, yeah, they absolutely would. This was, what was perceived as a crucial part of maintaining U.S. hegemony effectively.
that is so important, because it's been funny to me to see over the years people that have been involved in this so deeply behind the scenes who've just flat out said, oh, the CIA wasn't involved, or and I don't know whether that's just a cover story or whether they're truly that ignorant. I'm not quite sure where they're coming from. But when you look back at all of this and you dot the I's, cross the T's, do the work. And I always stress it's important to look at this outside of the ufology lens, because that's when you're truly going to find connections and breakthroughs with regards to some of the motivations behind all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think an interesting way to kind of look at the ufology question specifically, from a perspective of psychological warfare, is really through the prism of Naomi Klein's concept of the shock doctrine, which obviously, she had popularized during the last decade with the book with the same name, and I believe they've also made a documentary about it at this point. But she effectively argued that the techniques of MK Ultra have been applied on a massive scale. And essentially, this could be done through a coup or a natural disaster or something to that effect, something that would create a total shock to the public. And in theory, then you could go in and reorient the populace as a whole. And she based these notions off of what and Cameron had been doing with MK Ultra during the late 50s and the early 1960s. And she was actually much more accurate than she might have imagined. Well, obviously, she did make an educated guess. I suppose I shouldn't say that she might have imagined. But, okay, so the CIA had definitely been looking at this, this whole notion of effectively could the methods that they had been studying for mind control against individuals be employed on a massive scale. And I actually found out about this when I was researching, of all things, the Dutch intelligence services, certainly not the sexiest topic in the world, but their principal intelligence service, the BVD, had dispatched some representatives to the United States in the 1950s to study political warfare, and they had put them in contact with the MK Ultra guys who had effectively told them about what they were studying with this. So it is very much a thing with essentially this notion that you could take the methods of something like what Cameron was doing, though, they already had the so-called Artichoke Treatment, which was essentially the same thing for several years beforehand, and apply it to a massive scale. And that's where the whole thing with the UFO question is so intriguing in that sense. So a lot of this basically goes on the premise that you need a massive shock, effectively, to reorient the populace. And certainly the UFO question, that is a massive shock. That's often been the reason, given as to why, we can't have disclosure effectively, because it would destroy society.
Right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I would actually argue that in point of fact, it's the opposite. You don't want to tell people the truth because, the continuous lingering of this and the potential for that, shock is why it was so important to keep this going.
Well, and they've done studies. Study after study, looking at how would people react if a UFO landed? What would religious leaders do if they were confronted with the extraterrestrials? They've studied this for decades, and to me, I don't think that has anything to do with other than learning how to manipulate populations.
Yeah, exactly. I think if anything, like I said, all the studies have just been done basically as a way to determine how you could reorient the societies by supposed shock or something to that effect. But yeah, you can certainly see, because it's such an integral aspect, of the New Age movement effectively. I really don't think that you would have anywhere near the extent of a New Age movement in the modern United States if it hadn't been for the rise of UFO culture. And really, that's obvious if you go back and you look at theosophy, which, frankly, the modern New Age movement is basically theosophy with UFOs applied to it, if you really want to get down to it. But theosophy, it certainly had a dedicated following in the late 19th, early 20th century here. And it did sort of provide the bridgeway between, to the beats and then later the counterculture. But it never, gained anywhere near the kind of traction that the New Age movement has in the Cold War. And I just think a lot of that had to do with the revelations of ufology and the way that it was able to be tied into these, kind of metaphysical doctrines and so forth. It gave it a certain degree of credibility to the public that just, wasn't there in an earlier era. And I think that was because there wasn't that kind of direct shock, the possibility of an extraterrestrial life and non-human intelligence that you could theoretically interact with. That was a whole new component that, the Theosophists just simply did not really have at that extent in that era.
And this is interesting, and I want to go back because you mentioned a name, Dr. Cameron, and I am not sure if some of my listeners really know much about him or understand the breadth and depth of his maniacal work with regard to MK Ultra. But if you could, because I find that this is very interesting and there could potentially be some threads, unfortunately, in some of the things that are taking place now. But could you give us a little bit more information about who he was?
Sure, but I gotta emphasize, a lot of the stuff that Cameron has gained notoriety for, really was already being done by the CIA and the military much earlier. Essentially, you had Project Artichoke, and they had developed a series of techniques from that was referred to as the Artichoke Treatment, to show you the kind of imagination these people had, or simply the A treatment. But yeah, this, really encompassed a lot of, what Cameron was later known for. They would essentially inject you with a cocktail, usually with some kind of psychedelic. They would apply electroshock therapy to you. In the case of Artichoke, too, they had this one concoction, what was it known as? Smasher, I think, or Slammer or something like that. But it was a mixture of LSD and this other substance that actually caused, convulsions in the person who took it. So if you can imagine this, you're injected with LSD and then you start going into involuntary seizures. Okay. And then while you're going into the seizures, they strap you down into, a gurney or something like that, and then administer an electroshock directly to your brain. This was just the kind of insanity that, they were dealing with in this era. So, Cameron, was kind of right in league with this. His big innovation, in addition to doing these kinds of things, was really to provide sensory deprivation on a massive scale. On some instances, they would, they would inject the patients sometimes with psychedelics, sometimes with not. They would do the electroshock treatment, and then sometimes they would put them into these almost morgue-like or coffin-like confining spaces. They would leave them in there sometimes for days on end. And
I'm reminded of the movie Altered States for some reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it was, it was all based on this kind of stuff. And then on top of that, Cameron would also a lot of times record, therapy sessions, quote unquote, with his subjects. And then he would play snippets of these, from the tapes, on loops, to these women, as they were almost always women while they were in these confinements. And it was just weird stuff. I think one was a woman describing to Cameron the first time she had menstruated. And so, yeah, imagine listening to that account over and over again on a loop for 12 hours while you're on LSD. That's
not a good trip. No, that wouldn't be good. But he eventually had. So you've got people like this, and Poisoner in Chief is a really a great book about Sidney Gottlieb, which I would definitely recommend reading. And I'm wondering if specifically, when you've got Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, Mr. MK Ultra, you've got some of these people that are involved in psychological warfare operations and things, and then you've got the, Stanford Research Institute. You've got Dr. Hal Puthoff. You've got these people who are clearly working with or obtaining funding via some of these people. And so can you give us a little information on how we got from, NICAP, APRO to perhaps the remote viewing program and the mythology that has sprung out of that, if you don't mind?
Were you asking how we got from the from the behavioral modification experiments, the remote viewing experiments? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you for summing that up.
Okay. Okay. Well, Again, like most of this stuff, it really went back to Bluebird and Artichoke. And one thing I should probably clarify here, because this is a common misconception, Artichoke and MK Ultra were never connected. The Artichoke was not rolled into MK Ultra. Artichoke continued concurrently with MK Ultra until the early 1960s, in which case it was then later spun off into multiple other projects as MK Ultra, as also happened with MK Ultra during this time. And the successors to Artichoke continued to function until the early 70s, when they were finally shut down when the church committee stuff happened, which was the same thing that happened with MK Ultra. And on top of that, many of the heads of Artichoke and MK Ultra did not like one another. Quite a few of the individuals involved with Artichoke, such as General Paul Gaynor and Morris Allen, were actually quite anti-Semitic. So there was a considerable bit of animosity about Gottlieb for that reason, among others. So, yeah, there was a lot of infighting with these projects and so on and so forth. So I point this out because at least some of this stuff I think was at least driven partly by rivalries and professional jealousies and so forth. But okay, so as far as the interest in the psychic experiments and the ties to the mind control stuff goes, a lot of it actually probably originated with the Navy. Andrina Puharich was really the father of all this stuff. And of course, he's really well known for the channeling of the Nine and so forth. He's usually described as participating in MK Ultra, but he did not, though it does seem like he was involved in some component of Artichoke, but for the military and not for the CIA. So Puharich had always said that his research had begun under the auspices of something that was known as Project Penguin. This has always befuddled researchers because there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that there was a Project Penguin. However, there was a Project Pelican that the Navy had initiated in 1947, and Puharich had also begun work, at least he claimed for the Navy, on Project Pelican, or Penguin, around 1947. So it kind of jives, and obviously two bird names that start with P, it seems like it was a pretty good candidate for that. And Pelican itself was later rolled into Artichoke, so that was actually a program where there was a line of succession to it by way of Bluebird. And Pelican, I should probably point out, was a really horrendous program, too. Some information about that came out in the 1970s. And what little is known about it to the public suggests that it was basically a full-blown Clockwork Orange type procedure that they had looked at, where basically you had Navy men who were strapped into chairs, their eyes were clamped open, they were drugged, and they were, shown videos of children being raped and tortured and just wonderful things like that. So yeah, lots of strange stuff that went into that. But anyway.
And let me just interrupt you really quickly. So, so where were most of these programs taking place? Do you know?
Well, in the case of Pelican, sure you'll be interested to know, but at least some of the reports specifically about the chair and the videos were actually unfolding in San Diego, which probably goes in interesting connections to Robert Guffey's research and some of that. But some of this stuff took places in prisons, military bases. Artichoke actually did a lot more of the brutal stuff than MK Ultra, and that was partly due to the fact that Artichoke could actually operate all over the world. MK Ultra was technically supposed to be confined to the domestic United States, but they also did some work in Canada, obviously, which is where Cameron's experiments took place. But Artichoke would do a lot of stuff like in military bases that the U.S. had outside of the country for legal reasons. It, kind of provided a precursor for the tactics of extraordinary rendition that were later so lovingly embraced by the Bush II administration. But anyway, this interest in the odd and arcane stuff seems to have kind of originated with the Navy. It went into Project Bluebird, and then it ended up in Artichoke. And Artichoke would sponsor all kinds of crazy stuff. They were early sponsor of J.B. Rhine's experiments, for instance, in parapsychology. So you had this kind of connection going all the way back then. Of course, they had continued to sponsor some of Puharich's research, and that had actually led to a bit of a rivalry, I guess, with MK Ultra. Gottlieb had actually sent John Mulholland, who was a professional stage magician with absolutely no scientific training whatsoever, to investigate Puharich. Mulholland had alleged that Puharich was a fraud. There's been a lot of dispute about some of this, though. Apparently, Puharich had done something in their laboratory conditions that had disturbed Mulholland greatly, though he had never really talked about it, as I understand. But anyway, eventually, MK Ultra had gotten into the parapsychological racket as well, in theory to provide somewhat more scientific rigor to it, if you will. Artichoke was run out of the Office of Security, which was the internal security division of the CIA. They also did a lot of black bag type stuff for the CIA too. They were much more of an action arm, whereas MK Ultra was in the technical services staff. It was definitely more of a research thing. So TSS has a lot of scientists, Office of Security. It's more, veterans of the FBI and the military running that. So it's kind of felt maybe we should have actual scientists studying, parapsychology instead of glorified Pinkerton men. So that had led to some of this kind of stuff as well. But you almost had these sort of rival, parapsychological research programs going on in both Artichoke and MK Ultra by the late 1950s. And then, the Office of Research and Development also got in on the act. Gosh, I think it was like around the mid to late 60s. And they were also one of the bodies that had ultimately funded some of the stuff at SRI too. But that whole thing is kind of interesting too. This kind of goes into all the stuff with MK Often, which we don't actually know who headed it, but it was most likely Stephen Aldrich, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, who had overseen the ORD during that whole era.
And what era was that? What time frame did that take place?
This would have been like the, I believe, late 60s up through the early to mid 70s. Okay. And then Aldrich was replaced with some other guys. But Aldrich is a really interesting figure, too, who sadly we don't know very much about. But see, he had actually attended college with Puharich back in like the mid 1940s. And I know that he was definitely interested in a lot of these odd metaphysical things. He knew Peter Tompkins and that whole crowd as well. So Aldrich was another guy who had all of these strange interests in metaphysics. He also bizarrely turns up in the Kennedy assassination, like almost everybody, honestly. But he knew Gordon Novel, if I remember correctly, which is just really.
Why does that not surprise me?
Yeah. So, Aldrich was another one of these guys. And then, of course, Puharich would later become directly involved with the SRI stuff with Yuri. So that's kind of the thing that's interesting to me about SRI is, you basically had not one, not two, but three, basically, these mind control programs that almost all ended up gravitating to SRI by the late 60s, early 1970s. You had veterans from Artichoke. You had people from the ORD there. You had Gottlieb. Almost everybody kind of seemed like they were throwing their lot in there.
And then you've got this connection with Scientology and the EM meter.
Yeah. Well, again, sort of going back to Project Bluebird, one of the guys I've confirmed who was an OG Bluebird guy was Cleve Baxter, who himself was a quote-unquote polygraph specialist. Of course, he would gain infamy, I guess, during the 60s and 70s by claiming that he could communicate with houseplants and yogurts and other non-sentient things with his polygraph device.
Yogurt.
So, yeah.
Well, I've got some in the fridge. Maybe later tonight.
Yeah. All you need is a polygraph device, and you could have quite a fascinating conversation. So, yeah, he also had an interest in E-meter thing, and interestingly, he claimed to have known L. Ron Hubbard from at least 1949 or 1950, which was at the same time he was involved in Project Bluebird. So that's kind of interesting. Baxter apparently had known Hubbard. And, of course, I should point out, too, Hubbard was a Navy man, O&I veteran. There's some interesting allegations online. I think at McClory's blog or something like that, Hubbard had served with Morris Allen, the guy who ran the day-to-day operations of Artichoke, while both men were in the Office of Naval Intelligence during the 1940s. I haven't been able to definitively confirm that, though it does seem like both of them were stationed in New York City at the same time while they were working with the ONI. So it's possible Ron had known that. And of course, Ron also alleged that he had infiltrated Jack Parsons' whole setup in California for the ONI during the late 1940s as well. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that I always kind of point out, man. The Navy connections to a lot of this is very bizarre, but there's...
And Dr. Hal Puthoff was in the Navy,
yeah, I
right?
believe he was a Navy man, too, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And, also, the Office of Naval Research was another funding conduit for the SRI stuff as well. So you have that direct Navy involvement as well.
I mean, all of this is so interesting, but, when, we talk about, J.B. Ryan, we talk about some of these things, and then the interest of these organizations or specific people looking into parapsychology and ufology and all of these things, was that because it is a cover for other types of MK Ultra types of programs, or did these people truly have an interest? And would the government allocate millions upon millions of dollars to actually research something that is very difficult to research, or would they allocate money to projects that are actually trying to condition someone's mind or create a super soldier? Or, which direction would you think this is going?
Well, that's a very good question. Basically, when you really get down to it, I think the actual purpose of a lot of this stuff like MK Ultra and Artichoke was ultimately to understand consciousness and to determine if it could be weaponized effectively. However, that was not something that you were going to tell the bean counters about. So to answer your question, yes, I mean, the practical stuff like mind control and super soldiers, I mean, that definitely would have been what the accountants would have been told to justify the expenses for this kind of stuff, as opposed to, oh, we want to see if we can alter fundamentally the nature of reality. Yeah, that's not really the kind of thing in that era they would have been able to wrap their heads around. But, as to why I say that, though, a lot of this really goes back to the cybernetics movement, which came out of the Macy's conferences. Of course, the first one was in 1942, and then you had the little war years, and then kind of picked up again afterwards. But the Macy's conferences are endlessly fascinating. They have all kinds of ties to this MK Ultra stuff, to ufology, to all this good stuff. And ultimately, cybernetics came out of it. I think cybernetics effectively served a similar purpose as Jungian psychology did. Essentially, it applied.
And talk about cybernetics, because there's some younger people listening to this, or even probably older people, that don't understand exactly what cybernetics is.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's never really talked about anymore, even though really, I mean, so much of our society now is totally based off of cybernetic principles. But effectively, as my reading of it, and this isn't something you're going to find in textbooks, but I mean, I think effectively cybernetics was crafted to try to, well, A, to understand control systems and so forth. I mean, that's really the official explanation of it. But B, also to really provide a theoretical framework for understanding synchronicity. So within cybernetics, you have your systems and so forth, and these are constructed from feedback, all of these different feedback loops and so forth, and that ultimately leads to a system. So the universe is one giant system one giant system that's driven by all these different feedback loops and so on and so forth, and then you have all these different subsystems within one broader system. So as far as feedback goes, you've got two different types of feedback, positive feedback and negative feedback. Negative feedback is far more likely because it is system sustaining, whereas positive feedback is disruptive to systems and is comparatively rare, which is also interesting when you kind of look at, the fact that most social structures in the modern United States are based on cybernetic principles. This is one of the reasons why theoretically society is geared towards negative reinforcement so much, because it is system sustaining, theoretically. So to me, this is essentially a way of, really trying to apply a scientific explanation to something like the law of attractions or The Secret or something like that. Basically your output, that of each individual person, of animals, even of non-sentient beings and so forth, is creating these feedback loops and cycles, and then it is generating input that is coming back to them or you or whatever. So it's a very heady thing. I'm, to be honest, really shocked at just how theoretical and just out there a lot of this stuff was. But I mean, it has influenced so many different things. I mean, game theory, quantum physics really is an outgrowth of it as well. Information systems. I mean, almost all the guru stuff comes from cybernetics ultimately.
And so you had mentioned when I was talking about, cybernetics, the control systems, and Jacques Vallée. Can you go into that before we go to break?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Vallée's whole concept of the control system is totally based on cybernetics, and one of the theories that I believe he and some of these other people around him had kind of had is effectively that, UFO experiences and poltergeists and all this other stuff are responses from the control system, effectively, when it's being disrupted and so forth. And it was kind of theorized that one of the easiest ways to generate these kinds of responses was to initiate something that's referred to as a strange loop. And a strange loop is effectively two unresolvable paradoxes that effectively will become destructive to the system. So essentially, when you have these two unresolvable paradoxes running concurrently to one another, they will eventually initiate some kind of equally bizarre response, which could be defined as a UFO or something to that effect. And that, brings up some really just incredible speculations, if you will. I mean, this notion was later embraced by the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit of Warwick University, which produced the neo-reactionary darling known as Nick Land. Now, the CCRU had kind of grown out of the interest that these guys had in observing the Archaic Revival in San Francisco during the 1990s. The Archaic Revivals where Terence McKenna and all these people came out of. It was just this specter of this archaic, prehistoric religion, effectively, that was reemerging right in the heart of, the most cutting-edge technology in the world at the time. I mean, probably still is, right there in the middle of Silicon Valley and so forth. And to the cybernetics culture research people, this was a strange loop. It was a significant strange loop because you have this contrast of this archaic religion that shouldn't even exist in the modern world, and yet it's coexisting right there next to the, personal computer revolution. It's almost like a time warp, and effectively Land and some of the more extreme members did come to believe that it was an actual time slippage, but that's another topic. But getting into, SRI and all the stuff that's unfolding there. So what are these guys doing here with this psychic research, remote viewing, clinical term they came up for it? They're basically trying to revive fortune telling and that type of thing. And this later spawned, more broadly speaking, these New Age doctrines, which we had kind of talked about before, is basically theosophy, which is basically just Eastern traditions, these ancient wisdom traditions. So basically, again, you're seeing an almost archaic, prehistoric faith emerging right in the heart of cutting-edge technology. So you almost are left with the whole prospect that this whole SRI scene with the remote viewers and so forth was a strange loop. And ironically, Vallée was involved in both aspects of it. I mean, on the one hand, in the remote viewing program, but on the other hand, the computer research that was being done there by the Human Augmentation Center and so forth that ultimately produced PCs. So, yeah, that's really interesting.
Oh, Lord have mercy. It is really interesting. And we're going to take a 3-minute break. There's so much that you've put forward and so many things that are important, and it is always quite interesting to me to see how it's really goes down to a very small circle of people who've been involved, and they've used different narratives to justify their involvement over the decade after decade. And so it's fascinating. But like I said at the beginning of the show, we have to look past just the general, top of the pond. This is, you're getting UFOs, you're getting disclosure. This is what we're looking at, because it is so much more complex. And it is really important to understand the motivations and narratives of people, because in actuality, it's not for the greater good, I think, of all of us. It's to make money for a handful of people and to create a control system. That's my thought today. But we're going to take a break, and I am very happy to be here with you. Thank you so much, Stephen. You're amazing, and I want to thank all of my listening audience. Thank you for supporting the show. You can go to UFOclassified.com and help keep my show on the air. I do a lot of research, and I'm putting things together, and I'm doing this from the capacity of making sure that we are getting factual information, and it is against all odds, I can tell you, for me to do this. And so anyway, we're going to take a break. I want to play something again from Lauren Cutts, who I had on my show a couple months ago. We were talking about QAnon, which we're going to be talking about for the second half, and some other very interesting things, Robert Guffey and Camillio. So here you have Lauren Cutts and his solid silver boogie. Well, I just want to thank again Lauren Cutts for this wonderful music. I love it. I will be playing over the next few weeks other pieces by people, my friends who are musicians, and then also other clips as I can get them archived from the Ann Druffel collection. Very interesting interviews I'm finding with Richard Hall, interviews about Dr. James McDonald and Reverend Bailey, and all sorts of things. It's really fun for me to be able to look through all of this and again just see how really much all of this kind of narrows down to a handful of people, to places like Stanford Research Institute, UCLA, different things like that. It is really, really, really fascinating to me. So I am here tonight joined with Stephen Snider, a.k.a. Recluse, who has been in the conspiracy racket for over 10 years. And I love conspiracy racket. That just makes me smile. But he has been doing a lot of great things and looking at connections, which some of us, we look, like I said, I've mentioned several times tonight, we're looking at the very surface of something, but he's looking very deeply at some of the other connections. We mentioned in the first hour of the show, NICAP, and then also APRO, the UFO community, and some of the people in the intelligence community who have had a vested interest in manipulating this and things. And so I really am happy to have you here. And you also have a great podcast called The Farm, which is a cult podcast, and you contribute to Penny Royal Podcast as well. You're going to be branching out into different things, but I mean, first of all, thank you. Thanks for being here. You have given, like I was telling people, we need to listen to the show multiple times and make sure that we're writing down specific things and looking at people. You've laid out the MK Ultra, Gottlieb, Dr. Ewan Cameron up there in Canada doing some things and different types of things for us. And so we should be looking in Artichoke and Bluebird and oh my goodness, it's just, it's crazy. And it sounds like a conspiracy theory. And, a lot of people could say, well, it's just a conspiracy theory. But no, you've done your homework. For me, I wish this was a conspiracy theory. But when you look at some of these things and you look at the facts and the countless documents that you and your research partner have acquired over the past 10 years, then, I don't know how you can argue with some of these things.
Yeah, no, it would certainly make my life a lot easier if most of the stuff I talk about wasn't true.
Right. That's how I feel too. It's just like I was so excited when I was talking about, sitting out in a pasture and communing with the mothership and all of these things. But, and I still, like I always say, I still believe there is something around us that deserves study, but I don't believe that it is what any of these people have put forward.
Oh, yeah. And that's something, I always definitely want to make clear. I certainly believe that there are more things in heaven and earth than have been dripped in our philosophy. And certainly the things that have happened to me in the last year or so. Well, of course, I haven't even told you the full extent about all the circumstances around how I found you. But trust me, they're very strange. A lot of people probably want me committed if I told you half the circumstances I found you. So,
well, you might not want to go into all of them, but maybe just a little teaser there.
Let's just say they involve prophetic dreams.
Okay.
And not mine.
That is interesting. Well, we'll have to talk about that off air. It is interesting. I look back at everything and I'm just like, oh my God, it's like one interesting thing after another. And I don't know. It's a trip. And even in the past couple of days, I've had some things that have happened and I'm just like, whoa, and you can your mind starts to, I don't know what, overreact to things, especially after everything that has been going on in my life as of late. But it really is fascinating. And I'm grateful that we've found each other, because you've told me some things off the air that I have looked into that are verifiable, that are really, really interesting. And so you were talking about, I asked you about Jacques Vallée and about some of the control systems, and then the strange loop, and you mentioned Stanford research and Nick Land and things like that. So just, if you don't mind, just keep going on that thought process, with that thought process.
Okay. I'm trying to think about how we can get all this going here. Okay. Well, one of the things, that we'll probably get into here in a little bit is the whole concept of LARPing, which is very important, especially in this day and age. But obviously, when you think of LARPing, you typically think of some really silly things, people going to Renaissance festivals in their costumes and that type of thing, and that it couldn't possibly be something that's crucial. But it is, and I'm going to give you an example of that. It has to do with the famous Renaissance era cultist known as Bruno, who had advocated the use of fantasy as a way of spreading magical doctrines. And he, I believe, had made these suggestions, I believe, around the end of the 16th century, maybe the very early 17th century. But within a number of years, something very interesting happened, and that was that the Rosicrucian Manifestos started to appear. This would have been in the early 17th century, claiming that there was this mystical occult order that had existed for centuries, accumulating this ancient wisdom and so on and so forth. And it was utter nonsense. There's no Rosicrucians prior to the early 17th century, and there really were very few mystical orders that weren't Catholic ones. So it was total BS. But here's the thing that's very interesting about that. Within about a quarter of a century or so, the Rosicrucian Manifestos appearing, there was a vibrant scene of esoteric orders active in Europe. You had the rise of Freemasonry, of all this other stuff, and specifically speculative branch of Freemasonry. So, effectively, the Rosicrucian Manifestos were a LARP. And they were a LARP that created much of the modern tradition of Western occultism. So, that should give you an indication of the power of LARPing, and specifically the use of fiction and fantasy to spread esoteric doctrines, because that is a concept that is very, very relevant in this day and age. And going back to Mr. Nick Land and the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit for a moment here, one of the concepts that they had devised that I find to be especially intriguing is the whole notion of hyperstition. And basically, this was a notion of taking fiction, applying theory to it, and trying to manifest it into reality by spreading it through mass media and so forth, which was effectively the same thing that the Rosicrucians had been doing so many centuries ago. And even into the modern era, this had been a technique that had been used by occultists on and on. I mean, a really obvious example of this would be the Shaver Mysteries, which Raymond Palmer had begun to advocate in amazing stories, and there were so many variations done on. And now, up to the modern era, you've got the whole thing with the Hellier phenomenon, to say nothing of all of the accounts of underground battles between white hats and sinister forces that have proliferated in UFO communities. Now in the QAnon stuff and so on and so forth. So there was that. And then you can't forget about Kenneth Grant and his whole Lovecraft trip, the whole attempt to basically create a magical system around Lovecraft that's been picked up by so many people over the years. Of course, Michael Aquino got into that, Colonel Michael Aquino, Simon, quote unquote, with the Simon Necronomicon, and lots of other interesting people, all with the ideal of trying to usher the great old ones into reality. Why in God's name anyone would want to bring the great old ones into reality is not something that I can answer, but it seems to have been a long-standing obsession with a lot of these groups, and it was even something that Nick Land got involved in. Certainly, Lovecraftian mythos play quite heavily into the CCR mythos as well. So, you have just all of this obsession with this hyperstition and so forth, and this wasn't really a new concept that the CCRU had been had devised. It really was something that had been used by magicians and all these other eccentric types for years and years and years. And well, it becomes a question: what can all this type of thing do to reality fundamentally? And that had driven some other of the more arcane pursuits that ultimately I think had developed around the scene at SRI in the 1970s. Of course, you had this whole counterculture that grew out of it, and by the 1980s, it took a very interesting turn with the rise of what are known as alternate reality games. The first one of these was what was known as Ong's Hat. It emerged in the late 1980s, and it had been inspired by Robert Anton Wilson, who, of course, was very much tied into all the happenings at SRI and all that good stuff. Obviously, The intentions of these games and what became of them is highly debatable. I mean, I actually just had a conversation a few hours before I got on here with you with one of the individuals who had been involved in Ong's Hat in the 90s. A lot of these guys seem very remorseful now. I should say that about what's happened with their work in subsequent years. But yeah, it's an interesting thing.
And so who seems to be exhibiting remorse?
Well, I mean, obviously Joseph Matheny, who was really the principal creator of Ong's Hat, has been making the rounds in recent years, effectively acknowledging the QAnon as an ARG, and I guess it's sort of his way of making public apologies for this, effectively. Some of the people around him also, I think, have come to this realization and, are seeing the implications of this. But so let me try to explain Ong's Hat more for you guys out there, since I know it's not something people are super familiar with now. So Ong's Hat essentially claimed that there was a rogue group of physicists and magicians and so forth that had located to this town of Ong's Hat, New Jersey. It actually was a real place, but the town had actually been abandoned probably during the early 20th century. There's nothing of it left really anymore. But in the universe of Ong's Hat, they had sent up this, the Institute of Chaos Studies or something like that there. And effectively, they had developed a means of traveling between dimensions. It's all very fringe-like, in fact. In fact, I'm pretty sure that show had really ripped off the Ong's Hat literature pretty thoroughly. One of the means of transportation, what was known as the egg, which was basically a kind of sensory deprivation tank that you would go into after you had been given a heroic dose of psychedelics, probably done some kind of tantra work or something beforehand too, and then you slipped into the other dimension. Of course, they also, I think, had a typewriter or something like that, which you could use to communicate with the other dimension too, which was something fringe also.
Oh, cool, huh?
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. It's just funny how some of this stuff has come full circle in a lot of ways. It started as fiction. People started thinking it was real. It was later brought back into fiction, and then people started thinking it was real again. Mm-hmm. But the thing with Ong's Hat, and this is where they had problems, they started to combine it with conspiracy theories. And there was a lot of overlap specifically with the Montauk stuff. In fact, Peter Moon himself, who was, of course, the author of so much of the Montauk literature, had collaborated directly with Matheny during the 90s. And these two guys had, worked together specifically to try to blend the mythos. And, of course, other stuff was later incorporated into it, a lot of the old tropes like the Shaver Mysteries, Lovecraft's Trip. Of course, you started getting stuff from ufology inevitably into it. The Philadelphia experiment, of course, gets referenced and all that good stuff. And what happened is that people started to think that it was real, and they started to go into unstable flights of fantasy. And, and specifically Matheny, he's a smart guy. And one of the things that they had really looked at in all of this was different personality types and so on and so forth. I don't know. I think that they probably at least used the Myers-Briggs personality test to some extent, though I'm sure they probably had much more specific ones than Myers-Briggs. But, that's a good starting point if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, Matheny had done all this work, and effectively they had determined that there were certain personality types that could be triggered into unstable flights of fantasy by this type of literature. What they were concocting with Ong's Hat, this just blending of conspiracy fact, conspiracy fiction, and everything in between. So it was a very heady brew of concepts that they were working with. So Matheny continued Ong's Hat on until the early noughts, which case in the aftermath of 9/11 and just frankly the amount of, I guess, mental instability some of the participants had begun to display to him, he had decided to come out and once and for all acknowledge that Ong's Hat was just a game, that it wasn't real. But nonetheless, there are still people out there who do believe that Ong's Hat was real. And I mean, at the height of it, Matheny was being contacted by people who, were telling him that they had, gone to the other dimension. They had seen the Institute of Chaos Studies in this alternate reality or something like that, I mean, just insane. So all this stuff, though, with the ARGs starts to come out in the early noughts, and what happens then is the corporations start to move in, right? One of the first ARGs was actually another one that he had developed that was officially known as an ARG, and this was Majestic, which was based on all the Majestic 12 stuff. And of course, there's some speculation maybe the Majestic 12 documents were themselves a proto-ARG or an early version of it. That's more speculative on my part, but always a possibility. There was a lot of the same milieu at work in both. But, that's a topic maybe I'll get into at a later time. But, interestingly, one of the first official commercial ARGs was actually for the Steven Spielberg movie AI, which is kind of interesting because originally that was conceived of by Stanley Kubrick, who, as I'm sure a lot of people listening to this know, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about Kubrick.
Right.
Theoretically, AI was the film that he was supposed to be doing after he had finished with Eyes Wide Shut. Of course, he shed his moral coils shortly after Eyes Wide Shut came out, and his buddy Steven Spielberg took over the film, but based on concepts Kubrick had been developing for years and years. It's not really known, obviously, if he had ever intended the ARGs to be a part of it, but that would probably be quite a Kubrickian thing, I would imagine. So we can't discount that either. So anyway, these ARGs, they really start to proliferate, going into the early noughts. They start being used widely by corporations and so on and so forth. And they start compiling more data, and they also start to realize that these ARGs, among other things, are a wonderful way to profile human psychology and behavior and to predict it as well. And as I'm sure you can imagine, sooner or later, the military started to become interested in this. It's possible the military might have become interested at even an earlier date. In an interview I listened to with Matheny, he had noted that around 1990 or 2000, the Navy, because it's always the Navy, contacted him as they were interested in researching the synchronicities that had been generated by Ong's Hat, or at least in theory, that's what they were interested in. Regardless, by 2013, the military did officially start studying ARGs. It was within an agency within the Office of National Intelligence. What was this group called? Here we go. Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. That was one of the kind of variations of DARPA, the whole ARPA network. And they had developed their own program to effectively study these ARGs. It was known as You Are Here. Yeah, really clever. And it was the whole purpose of basically using ARGs as a means of studying behavior and psychological profiles. So, things that have effectively come full circle in the span of about a quarter of a century from when Ong's Hat was released. Matheny and everybody involved in this stuff had been aware of how these, programs could be used to quantify personality types, but after the corporations had become involved, well, the possibilities were just really endless. And it was inevitable that the military-industrial complex would find this kind of research, I think, irresistible at a time. But one thing, though, that I think is really relevant to point out here when we kind of get into our later discussions is some of the guys who were heading the intelligence agencies at the time. Of course, the Office of National Intelligence, which was overseeing this, was headed by James Clapper. The CIA at the time was headed by John Brennan. And the Defense Intelligence Agency was headed by General Michael T. Flynn. So if you've been following politics for the last 4 years, the actions of these three men in public could probably be charitably described as LARPing. At least that's how I would characterize a lot of what they've been doing in various talk shows, circuits, and TV interviews for the last 4 years. So, it's really interesting that these guys were heading some of the major intelligence agencies at the time that the defense establishment was officially investigating ARGs.
and this is just also fascinating to me. And so I want to ask you a little bit about when you look at Michael Aquino, you look at John Alexander, you look at these people who have their background is psychological warfare, and then you see how they overlap with, say, Skinwalker Ranch or some of the other things, or QAnon or different things. I mean, what are your thoughts on what is Skinwalker Ranch?
Well, I mean, I very much think that Skinwalker Ranch was possibly an attempt to apply some of these ARG techniques, effectively to see if you could induce paranormal phenomena effectively. And again, when you look at the NIDS people, the guys who were involved with that, people like Christopher Green, people like Hal Puthoff, I mean, these guys all came out of that nexus at SRI, which Robert Anton Wilson was very much a part of. And, if we're going to use a bit of a D&D analogy here, you could maybe look at the Illuminatus trilogy and the Cosmic Trigger as a kind of, let's just say, player's handbook, if you will, for a lot of this later kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know if that was deliberately what they had tried to do with this kind of stuff, but it did seem to work out that way regardless. So anyway, I mean, all of these guys kind of came out of that nexus. They end up working for NIDS in the mid-90s, around the time when they started building up this whole mythos with Skinwalker. And it really seems to follow the same pattern that, really magicians had been using going back to potentially the 16th century. And, what these ARG guys have been looking at going to at least the 1980s, and that was that you could go to an area, you could take, mythology that was already present there, and then you could start adding what were full-blown fictional elements to this as a means of creating a new kind of mythos. And, all good ARGs, as I've noted to you before, there's an element of a treasure hunt to it. It's very important that people go out and act out these actions in real life. Certainly, you didn't quite have a full-blown treasure hunt with Skinwalker Ranch, but you did have something a little bit similar, and that's the whole concept of a haunted house, basically. You've got these different places that people can go to and play out these, scenarios, effectively from kind of horror fiction. And you could obviously enhance these things with non-lethal weapons, with all kinds of other stuff. And again, it wouldn't surprise me, but I would imagine that there was probably some kind of an attempt to psychologically profile the people that they were inviting to go onto the grounds with the ranches. I mean, I know you had mentioned to me in the interview I'd done with you earlier this week that, they had been asked questions about paranormal experiences and things like that. That's another issue where I think on some level there's a belief that, experiencers, people who have had these kinds of things happen to them in their lives, it might be genetic, they might have a quote unquote an antenna or something to that effect. So you're looking for people like that, specific kinds of players for these types of things. But I mean, it really does seem like that they're trying, this was an early attempt effectively to take some of these concepts that had been developed with these ARGs and apply it to what was effectively an experiment in human psychology, and then possibly also an experiment into what really constituted reality itself. And could it be altered at a certain level? I mean, again, it's kind of present in the title of these things, alternate reality games. Well, what if it doesn't become a game any longer? And that's kind of, I think, what was partly the purpose of Skinwalker, to take it to the next level where it's just an alternate reality and no game anymore.
Okay, and that is absolutely fascinating. It's funny because I think people that look into, the ranch, you've got two, you've got the fanatics who are, this is E.T. and I'm, yada, yada, yada. Or you've got the people that are just diehard, well, there's nothing to see here, and there might not be a potential that any of this other type of stuff would be going on covertly. And I think that you've laid out some pretty good groundwork as to the different types of layers that go into some of the work that these people are doing behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, you look at what was happening with Ong's Hat kind of concurrently. I mean, you've got people basically having full-blown breaks with reality, convinced that they're, traveling into alternate dimensions and things like that. And this is just, from leaving messages on chat rooms and the internet and Xeroxing brochures from catalogs, that don't actually exist and leaving them in, coffee houses across the country and what have you. So, what happens if you put people in an isolated ranch and, you start using Camellia, suits on them, or just this, all kinds of other non-lethal weapons or something like that. I mean, what could you get people to believe then effectively? And, in some senses, I do think there was also a curiosity as to whether or not you could generate something extraordinary. I mean, it does seem like when it comes into a lot of these types of operations, they're very interested in finding specific types of people. Personality has something to do with it, but I mean, there also does seem to be this, obsession with finding people that are experiencers, for lack of a better term, and they find us, and they have some interesting, I guess, techniques. Trying to take advantage of our talents, I guess.
And that, that has been, unfortunately, fortunately, I'm seeing a lot of things with regard to, abductions or experiencers, whatever we're calling, them, today. But, you've got people who are going in and willingly submitting to these personality tests online and disclosing personal information about themselves. And, you can just, you read through a lot of the fine print and you don't realize, and I'm going to bring up MUFON and the John Carpenter and the Bigelow thing, where they've specifically changed the wording and it's very small. And if you were just going out there because you'd had an experience, you would overlook a lot of that, like we do with the Nest that we've got in our house, or some of these things that we don't realize all of the other parties involved in this that are getting information or access to our data. But you've got these abductees. It's like, okay, great, I've had this experience. I'm going to go in there and they're asking questions, about really personal questions about sexual activities, about religious ideologies, about, just some of the things that I've looked at with these different groups that are putting forward these surveys, and I'm just thinking, holy crap. I mean, here you've got a group of people who've had experiences. You're going to pull them into different places, databases, get their information. God knows who you're giving it to, and then what happens at that point. And I've had a couple people on that work for the MUFON's Experiencer team in the past month, and I've asked that, okay, so where is this data going? Because we know it's been bought and sold. And to what end? And we know the $22 million that was allocated by the Pentagon to study, quote unquote, UAP, was actually, some of that was allocated to buy data of people that were going in there and sharing their very personal experiences. Why is that? Because to me, it is very, very clear that has nothing to do with UFO research. That has to do with profiling somebody's personality.
Yeah, I mean, it very much does. And I mean, just, again, whatever the specific interest it is. And I mean, it's just odd to me, but I mean, I do think a lot of the people that are obsessed with this, there's a certain amount of jealousy, honestly, and even contempt, fear, maybe even for people who they would designate as experiencers or genetically different human beings or something to that effect. But I mean, it's just, it's an odd thing. I mean, really, most of the populace think that it would be wonderful, effectively, to be an X-Men or to be different or something. But I mean, speaking as somebody, I mean, I had an OBE at a very young age. I've had paranormal experiences. I saw my first UFO this year, and I have generally always been a very different person. And it's not fun. It really isn't. And that's generally been and talking to other people who have had these kinds of experiences or have had the similar things happen to them in their life, they didn't have a lot of enjoyment out of it either. You're dealing with things that much of society at large would largely scoff at or dismiss, so that in and of itself is problematic. And then on top of that, there are people in positions of power who are interested in you for whatever reason and decide that it might be wonderful to try to toy with you to see what exactly the responses would be to come from it. Which makes them profoundly sadistic on a lot of levels if you really think about it, since you're basically already trying to toy with people who are marginalized in some way or other in the first place.
That's a great point, and I think it is interesting that, it's like you're trying to toy with people and you have sadistic qualities, and yet these people are the people that are held up in high regard in the UFO community.
The sad thing is I don't even, to their perspective, I don't even think they see this as toying, with people. To them, it's research. It's maybe even helping people in some warped way. That's, I think maybe the most frustrating thing about all of this is I don't think the people doing this kind of research really understand just, how cruel it really is on a lot of levels. But yeah, it's very warped, to put it mildly.
It is. And I've got to ask you, so let's talk about Robert Guffey, because you have come into his orbit. Robert Guffey has been on my show before, and Robert Guffey wrote a book that has been referenced in the work of Jacques Vallée, Forbidden Science 4. He's been referenced by George Knapp and Colm Kelleher and all of these people. And so tell us a little bit about your encounter with Robert Guffey. And I just want to say, I know that some people might think I'm going kind of further afield with this, and it has nothing to do with UFOs, but it does come back, and it has everything to do with UFOs, because these are the things that have been inserted into the narrative, and we have to understand where they're coming from. So please tell us about Robert Guffey and your experience.
Yeah, well, I became interested in his work a couple of years ago when I was finishing up my first book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical. There's an essay in there, it's actually almost a full-length work. I think it ended up being around like 25 or 30,000 words. But anyway, it was a sort of brief history of the private military and private intelligence rackets in the modern era. And, of course, when you're going to go into private intelligence companies, you pretty much inevitably have to talk about SAIC, which he gets into quite heavily in Camilio. I have long been fascinated by the prospect that a lot of these behavioral modification programs we were discussing in the first hour had been, outsourced full-blown in the 70s, 80s, and it was companies like SAIC who had effectively taken over these projects. I unfortunately did not quite get around to doing that in the book that I was working on at the time, because, as I said, I think the essay was already around like 25 or 30,000 words. And I'm like, oh my Lord, if I'm going to go down that road, I might as well just take the essay out and make it into a full-blown book. I didn't want to do it at that point in time. So I was like, I'll get back to this later. But anyway, based on some things that had happened in my personal life, I had, again, been reminded of his research lately, and that was why I dug out Camilio and had wanted to talk to Robert. And, it was definitely a great interview, and it's just really fascinating to get his whole take on, now what we would think of as gang stalking and trolling and doxing and all this kind of stuff. Which has become so relevant, especially now in this past decade, probably some of the topics we'll get into here in a few minutes. But yeah, I also think that this, in turn is also very much a part of this kind of ARG concept. It really is a kind of LARPing, specifically, for the people who are hired to do this, kind of harassment operations and stuff on a personal level. And, again, too, sort of getting back to the element of just, this human experimentation and toying with people who have had unusual experiences. I don't really want to get into this too much in the air, but I'm certainly aware of people who have had unusual experiences and who have been subjected to this, type of gang stalking and trolling and just digital harassment as well. And, I do think, at least in this case, in some of these cases at least, that this is, again, a continuation of these experiments in human consciousness. Again, it's another way of essentially applying pressure to individuals who, for whatever reason, I think that they're fascinated by, I'm sure from their perspective, it's a benevolent kind of fascination that might theoretically make the world better or whatever. But for the people who actually have to go through with it, it's pretty terrible. I can definitely assure you of that. And yeah, it does sort of raise, again, the prospect, is this just another type of sadistic experiment to try to see what, effects will be produced in people who they think are genetically different. Obviously, this is only for certain individuals. I mean, more broadly speaking, a lot of these tactics are probably used to silence whistleblowers or, maybe in some cases just to take marginalized people to see what will happen when they're subjected to these kinds of tactics and techniques and so forth. But yeah, really one of the more disturbing prospects I think we have to face when we sit down and look at the small group of people who devised, these things that we've been talking about now for almost an hour and a half. When they ultimately sat down and thought about doing these things, the rationale was like, well, we're going to try to see if we can, drive somebody insane and see if that enhances their psychic ability, because we can. That was the only real rationale, because we can. Well, it's sadly, it seems like that's what's driving a lot of our society now on a lot of other levels, and that's a terrible reason for doing anything.
Well, it is, and I just think when you just mentioned that, I mean, of course, one of the first things that comes to mind, I've got a couple things actually, but it is Paul Benowitz.
Yeah,
and what happened to him, and the fact that, again, you've got the same players involved, yet these same players are held up to, I mean, they're cult-like heroes. How in the hell does that happen?
Well, I mean, again, I just think it goes back to, the fact, I just think that people don't want to realize that there is this sort of insanity that prevails amongst these people. I mean, even to this day and age, it seems inexplicable to a lot of people that such efforts would be driven, to try to drive Benowitz insane. I mean, was one eccentric scientist really worth that kind of trouble? But I mean, if you're going at it from this kind of perspective of human experimentation, and I mean, again, with the Benowitz affair, you also have elements also of the whole ARG concept. I mean, you sort of have the whole treasure hunt concept with them trying to come up with this false base, Dulce, that, I mean, you've got people going out now to this day wandering around in the Four Corners area trying to uncover and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's sad and it's fascinating in equal measures when you look at something like that. You have this just total harassment, this blending of reality with fiction that's being concentrated on this one individual. Possibly it's a personalized experiment to see what will happen to him. Maybe they think that he's a unique human being, maybe not, who knows. But on a broader level, I mean, it's also a kind of sociological experiment. You're myth-making through this kind of harassment on this poor guy. And certainly the myth is still with us, and it's still inspiring people. So, yeah, it's just so insidious on so many levels.
I know, and it is insidious. And that's, I keep thinking about, I mean, I have some documentation here, some interviews with Benowitz, and I mean, to hear the fact, I mean, to read the kind of the terror in his voice, and to understand that he understood that somebody was screwing with him, but he didn't really understand, which way to go, which is the whole point. It's like, and then you've got people who are, flying you over specific areas with a crashed saucer, and you've got, messages that are coming through on your computer and all of these things. And you think, holy crap, I mean, how different is this than some of the people that we're seeing now in the UFO community who are coming forward that have been, hey, come with us. Well, you can get this private tour over a crashed UFO place. And if you're lucky, then you can hold a piece of it. I mean, how
Yeah, well, I mean, you see sort of like the elements in something like American Cosmic, for instance. I mean, that whole first half of the book where they're going out in, like, what is it, New Mexico or something like that, to this, crash site where allegedly there's the, UFO wreckage and what have you, and they're allegedly trying to cover up the location, but really, I mean, they talk about how it's fairly close to where scenes from an X-Files movie were filmed in the 90s. I mean, this isn't something that would be that difficult for somebody to figure out, really, so again, I mean, it's just sort of a treasure hunt, you leave just enough vague instructions that you can probably get people going out to those deserts with their metal detectors and so forth, trying to see if they too can find this exotic technology out there. So yeah, it just kind of continues on and on and on.
And so let's talk a little bit about the media. And you mentioned Steven Spielberg, you mentioned Stanley Kubrick, and some of these people that have obviously been, or potentially have been put in place to continue or keep, or to create a myth in all of us. And it's been really funny, and I've mentioned this on different shows. I've been watching, Close Encounters and E.T. and all of my childhood favorites. And it's funny when you sit there, or The Man Who Fell to Earth, and you sit there and you can see in specific portions of the show, like there's, Richard Dreyfuss is making a run for, to convene with the mothership and, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got these crates that say Raytheon on the side of them. Or you've got The Man Who Fell to Earth, and you've got David Bowie going by a tall building, and you've got General Motors on the back of it, or on the top of the building. Or you've got, the X-Files with the guy wearing the NICAP hat. And so, what is the connection there? Are they, I mean, just give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent it is predictive programming. I mean, though I think people go way too far off the deep end with some of this stuff. But I mean, yeah, there is a certain, element to that. I mean, honestly, one of my favorite examples of that is actually David Fincher's movies from the 90s. I mean, really that whole trilogy of films that he did after Alien 3, 7, The Game, which is really crucial in relation to all the stuff we've been talking about. And finally, Fight Club. Fight Club, in hindsight, is almost a blueprint, for now, like what we think of as like the Proud Boys and what have you. And it's really sickening that it's still held up by, so many people as this, anti-authoritarian manifesto and what have you. I mean, okay, think about this movie, all right? The main character suffers from dissociative identity disorder, okay? His alternate basically establishes a cult of brainless followers whom he dubs space monkeys that he ultimately sends out on a quasi-terror campaign that climaxes with them attempting to liberate the nation by blowing up all of the financial records, and then ending with the great new future that they had ahead of them after the explosion had gone off. There's a reason why the movie ended at that right specific moment, and the reason being that if somebody actually did this in real life, what would happen the very next day is the country would descend into massive, massive rioting and all kinds of other crimes when people wouldn't be able to buy anything. And then from there, martial law would be imposed, probably with Tyler Durden and his followers being rounded up rather swiftly and probably executed at secret tribunals with the kind of insanity that they had spurred. But, yeah. You don't really hear about the implications of all that too much when people talk about Fight Club. Yeah, and it's even more absurd when you sort of see that one of the major icons, I mean, of the new right, alt-right, whatever you want to call it nowadays. Zero Hedge has even taken the whole Fight Club thing. I mean, full length of the writers being dubbed Tyler Durden and all this other stuff. And yeah, I mean, this is just the subculture that this spawned. But yeah, and I mean, you see the same thing sort of playing out with a lot of the UFO movies. I mean, certainly Close Encounters and a lot of this other kind of stuff was so instrumental in crafting the Space Brothers notions, I guess, that were popular later on. And then more recently, you know, you got the stuff like Independence Day and so forth, which has sort of promoted this almost Manchian apocalyptic take on the UFO phenomenon, which again certainly could be spun in a lot of sinister ways, depending upon, you know, what happens with certain psychological operations. But I mean, you know, just sort of put that in perspective, I mean, we can kind of see now in the modern era what Fight Club has been used for as a textbook. So, I mean, again, you can only imagine what happens if something like Independence Day becomes a textbook.
Well, and I think the more I look into all of this, the more I would say if I had personal experiences, I certainly would be very selective about who I shared them with, and I wouldn't be putting them out there on Facebook like so many people do continually.
Yeah.
And
by the way, you should never put any of this kind of stuff on Facebook. That's a very bad idea. Really, you should say as little on Facebook as humanly possible anyway. It works well for me. Like I was just telling you before we started this, I'm so good. Facebook thinks that I'm based in New Mexico, and I've never even set foot in New Mexico in my entire life.
Well, I mean, and you know, you look at the fact that, you know, some of the, you know, like MUFON, some of these organizations have really gone by the wayside, and now, I mean, obviously they're, whatever is taking place, and they can do all this data collection in the social media form. And so I just try to caution people, you know, like, stay out of certain groups, don't give too much information. I think that's really important, because Lord knows how that's being manipulated at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, you know, and another thing really are like these surveys. I mean, I know you talked about that with like MUFONs and what have you, but I mean, it's not just for, you know, I mean, experiencers. I mean, just all of these surveys that you take online. I mean, these things are a gold mine for these kind of institutions. I mean, in the case of Cambridge Analytica specifically, they had really leaned heavily on that, the company based in Utah, Qualtrics, I believe. Which,
which is still making news these days as well. So.
Yeah. And a big thing of what they did were just those surveys that they would send out to people. But I mean, those surveys that Qualtrics was administering, I mean, served as a basis for a lot of the data that was harvested by Cambridge Analytica to come up with these personality profiles that they used. So, I mean, even just something that seems as, you know, innocent as just taking a little, you know, online survey like that. I mean, there's a way that could be weaponized against you. I mean, it's just chilling.
Well, I actually did one last night just for fun, which, you know, obviously I'm
I mean, people like taking surveys. I mean, it is kind of fun to take them. I mean, that's why
I know
it's
like,
so
what's your
terrible.
cat personality? What celebrity do you? I mean, it's just so dumb, and you know, whatever. But it does kind of hook you in, and so I want to say, because, you know, I mean, I am going to clearly need to have you back time and time again, so prepare yourself. But you know, you're talking about Cambridge Analytica, and then you're talking about the connection to Utah, which I'm trying to make very plain for people. I mean, Utah is the hub for a lot of different things, including one of the biggest concentrations of the aerospace and defense contractor, you know, industry in America. And you also have we're the data collection hub, you know, and we were one of the first places that was toying around with the internet, with the University of Utah and Stanford Research back in the late 60s, you know. And so we have a lot of stuff going on here, and because we are such kind and accepting people, for the most part, we don't necessarily ask questions, and therefore a lot of things can happen when we're not looking at things and holding people accountable, or at least making the connections with this. And so give us just a little brief comment on the culture in Utah, and perhaps some of the things that are going on. You mentioned earlier, you know, you've got the people, you mentioned Blue Book, and I wanted to say that Ancestry.com conveniently owns the digital files for Blue Book. fascinating, coincidence there. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at it, but I mean, I tend to think that a lot of it goes back to sort of the Mormon nexus. Again, the Mormons have had ties to the U.S. intelligence community for many years, and I mean, also organized crime. Certainly, that kind of plays into the whole fiasco with Howard Hughes and what have you in the 1970s, where, essentially you ended up with the Mormon mafia involved in large swaths of Las Vegas. So, I mean, it does kind of raise the question, because, you and I have talked about this privately, but I mean, certainly it does seem like Vegas is a huge hub for a lot of this kind of stuff. And you did have those strange connections there that started to emerge in the 1960s and the 1970s. But yeah, I mean, it's just Utah is kind of unique in that sense, in that you do have. I really want to use the C word to describe the Mormon Church, but that's probably a little mean. Well, okay. So anyway, you have the LDS, which it has a long history of secrecy. Let's just put it at that. And practically being a state religion there, well, I mean, it creates a lot of unique prospects for Utah that wouldn't necessarily be prevalent in a lot of other places of the country. And I mean, beyond that, certainly the Mormon Church has been useful in implementing U.S. political agendas for any number of years. This is something that's really obvious when you've been looking at the modern history of Mexico, as I have recently in preparation for one of my podcasts. But, again, you have a lot of these fundamentalist Mormon sects that have been living in northern Mexico for nearly a century now. I mean, some of these families are quite prominent, most notably the Romney family. A lot of them are dual U.S. Mexican citizens, and the U.S. has leaned on them quite prominently for years and years now to represent U.S. interests in Mexico. So, I mean, just alone, you have these sort of really prominent politically connected families there who have been used as tools of U.S. foreign policy for quite a considerable amount of time. And, I mean, in more recent years, this has just led to some incredible developments. I mean, just take the case of the LeBaron family, for instance. I mean, the LeBarons have been implicated in all kinds of just insanity there for a very long time. Of course, there was the patriarch, Israel LeBaron, I think, who was known as the Mormon Manson.
Wasn't it Herbal LeBaron?
He was based out of Mexico. I mean, his family members have been involved in, I think it was something like 25 or 30 murders or something like that. There was this strange element there. But, right. I mean, more recently, the LeBaron family was in the news for the 9 family members that were killed in Mexico in 2019, allegedly by the drug cartels. Of course, the family certainly used that as a means to give them a platform to lobby President Donald Trump to classify the cartels as terrorist organizations, which in turn would enable the United States to deploy the military, i.e. JSOC, to Mexico. And certainly if you know anything about Mexican history, having the United States military in Mexico is not something that many Mexicans have any desire whatsoever for. But it gets even more insidious than that. The LeBaron family also had ties to Nexium. Quite a few family members are involved with Nexium, and in fact, the LeBarons had been providing girls to Keith Raniere in New York State. So, this is just one kind of peculiar family, and you can see how they have these ties to these strange full-blown cults with Nexium, but also, I mean, being used as tools of American foreign policy. And I mean, that just brings up so many staggering implications. I mean, Nexium itself was really an outgrowth of the human potential movement and all this kind of stuff we've been talking about related to the New Age. I mean,
right. And we didn't even go in. That's another thing I need to have you back on, because we didn't go. I mean, you look at the New Age movement. You were mentioning San Francisco. You were mentioning, we didn't even talk about the Esalen Institute. We haven't talked about. I mean, we haven't talked about some of the different, the Monroe Institute. We haven't talked about, I mean, there's so many places to go where, you know, I mean, 5 years ago, I would have turned and said, hey, that's really cool. Let me get the HemiSync and put that little, you know, program up and figure out how I can make myself better and you know, a superhuman being and yada, yada, yada. But it's like, okay, now that I'm looking at things, and I don't know, it's a little concerning, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, the human potential movement is just, it's something that's been so romanticized, things like Esalen, and I mean, you know, it's had such a tremendous influence on the New Age movement. But I mean, you know, to be perfectly honest, I mean, if you really want to see what the human potential movement is about, look at freaking Nexium. That's a direct outgrowth of the human potential movement. Or look at the darker implications of these alternate reality games, which are also an outgrowth of the human potential movement. So, yeah, I mean, what a lot of this stuff...
and we didn't even talk about David Wilcox.
Yeah. I mean, what a lot of this stuff, ultimately, when it's taken to its logical conclusion, ends up becoming is just monstrous. I mean... It really is. And yeah, it's, you know, another thing that's just sad that more people do not realize just the implications of some of these things. I mean, you know, to give you an anecdote, my research partner, Keith Allen Dennis, he had a great lesson for his kids when he was watching Stranger Things with them. Went to the part where the scientist who was based in Ewan Cameron was doing some of his experiments. He brought his kids up, pointed to the guy and said, boys, this is what Dumbledore looks like in real life. And, yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, I just have to sit here and collect my thoughts because I'm so just kind of mind blown to all of the connections and, you know, the gaming. We haven't talked about DEF CON in that conference and Richard Thiem and Kit Green and the way that they use the hacker community to, you know, infiltrate a lot of these things. And I mean, there's so much more that we need to talk about. It's just amazing. But I think the one thing that we really have to just say, you know, is that the UFO community has been a prime target to be manipulated by all sorts of different groups, and we have to be so careful with that because we're all on a journey. We're looking for something. We've had different experiences and we want to know the truth, and yet when we try to find it, we get hooked up with some of these people, these organizations, you know, whatever, you know, and it's just not empowering, and it's not in the greater good. Not. And I think, you know, we look at the New Age community, you look at the way that QAnon or whatever, you know, has infiltrated the New Age community, and now you've got people that are, you know, supposedly, you know, into health and vitality and empowerment, and they have been completely just pushed off course, and now they're promoting ideas that are very, very dangerous, in my opinion. And so it's just like, holy crap.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole concept of buying into this notion of the Great Reset versus the Great Awakening, quote unquote. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it'll be a kind of awakening, but not what they're thinking it's going to be.
No, and at the end of the day, how could a movement that is supposedly based on love and kindness and expanding consciousness and doing all of these things, how could it be so hate-based?
Well, like I said, you know, I mean, we talked about this before, but, you know, you kind of get inclinations of this when you go back and look at a lot of the channeled material that's come out over the years and just what a lot of these sages ended up saying about the Jews. Like I always say, you know, if you really want to see where some of these characters are at, if you ever get a chance to go to some of these channelers in contact with the Space Brothers, just ask them how they feel about the Jews. Based on some of the responses people like Delmar de Veras and George Hunt Williamson got, it's interesting, to put it mildly.
Well, I'm thinking when you think that you know, the benevolent Space Brothers are blonde-haired, blue-eyed beings that are here to instill, you know, love and light, and they're the, you know, the better, you know, I mean, come on, we've heard that before, but hey, I guess you can wrap it up like an alien and sounds good at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it certainly makes Nazism look a lot better in hindsight.
Well, No comment. Yeah, I'm going to have you back. I am going to have you back. You are really, this has been a fun show. It's been a show that is going to make me think for a long, long time. And so I appreciate you being here. And tell everyone where we can find the farm, because I've got people in chat that want to know, they want to listen to the podcast.
It is thefarmpodcast.com. And we also just had our Patreon section open up. So if you become a subscriber, you get 2 extra full-length shows per month. So that would be a total of 6 shows a month. But we still got the 4 available each month. They are uploaded every Monday. So definitely check those out. And yeah, going to have Erica on. Well, I mean, we already recorded her show. It'll be up in a couple of weeks. And I got all kinds of other people. Just had Alex Karras from Skeptico on. I have Christopher Knowles of The Secret Sun on pretty regularly. Robert's going to be on very soon. I've had Jason Horsley, Douglas Valentine, Richard Spence, all kinds of great guests. And, in relation to some of the stuff we've been talking about, I'm hoping very soon to do a show with one of the Ong's Hat people, actual participant in Ong's Hat, on QAnon and the ARGs and everything that's going wrong with all of that in the 21st century.
And it's just so fascinating. Thank you for opening my eyes to some of these things. And it's, like I said, I keep peeling back layers and doing research, and it's really fascinating. And I will say that I wish that I could sit here and talk about the mothership and talk about all of these things, but I want to, and I think I will at some point in time, talk about some of the great things in the Androffel files and some really great UFO cases. But right now, what I'm seeing we need to take this into consideration. We need to look at this because we don't want to be fooled again. And we're all in this for disclosure, quote unquote, whatever that is. I don't need the government or any entity like that to tell me what it is, because I know my own personal experiences. But this is important. We need to understand what is taking place, because there have been very few people in the past 60 years who've actually come out and said, hey, wait a minute, look at this. This is important. You're being manipulated. And I'll keep doing that. You're going to keep doing that. And so I just really, really appreciate you very, very much. And I hope you stay safe. And I want to just tell everybody out there who is supporting the show, is getting in there in chat, asking questions. I appreciate you. And I apologize, Peter, I didn't get to ask your question, but I will touch base with you this week. And Craig and Northern UFOs, Mario, Scott Brown from In the Field, all of you make this journey important for me. This is us doing this together. And so I appreciate it. I love you guys. Please stay safe. And remember that this is a strange time. So just be kind to other people and do the right thing. It's really not that hard. And make sure you understand It's
2020. The old rules do not apply anymore.
Clearly. So thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate it. And thank all of you. Thank you so much for being here. You guys stay safe. And I will have Stephen on again very soon. Thanks for listening to UFO Classified. You can go to ufoclassified.com to check it out. Be safe. Have a wonderful weekend. And we will catch you next Friday.
So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am. My skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got, no matter what the situation is. You just kind of adapt and overcome.
What are you going to do with all this? You can't even take care of your own files and get them put into the current system, but yet you want to go collect other people's things. So what are you going to do with it? Who are you giving all this to?
It just really struck me about how the common thread seemed to be deception, but deception of human nature. So that's what I started thinking, who would these folks be? I mean, then I started thinking about the intelligence agencies, what role they could play, and what would be their motivations for getting involved in ufology.
I'm not saying that because the gimbal is not a rotating flying saucer, that means that all the UFOs are false. Not at all. All I'm doing is I'm looking at this one case, these individual cases, and seeing if there's an explanation for those. So try to, if I could ask people out there listening, don't think that I'm trying to attack your entire beliefs about these things.
Nice to be in orbit.